Dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today's topic for discussion is conflict reporting, issues and challenges. The main objectives of today's lecture are to understand the impact of conflict on the working of press and media, to understand the challenge faced by media personnel in reporting from conflict zones, and finally, to understand how the media personnel navigate the difficulties while reporting from the conflict zones. Dear students, let's begin with the introduction first. Conflicts in general are not new to human societies. They are as old as human societies because they have been in existence in all spheres of human life since the beginning of history. A conflict, however, becomes an abnormality when it results to violence. There are some predictable truths of the war. The most common is that old saying, "The first casualty of war is the truth." Another is that as conflict deepens and worsens, reporting becomes less accurate and less specific. The fog of war mists up the media's lens. The responsibility of mass media is to narrate the facts as they are, impartially, accurately, and responsibly, in order to help the readers and viewers to create an informed public opinion. Journalism is a public service profession. As such, reporting can be done relatively easier when a society is at peace. The real challenge, however, for reporting accurately, impartially, and responsibly is when a society is in violent conflict. It is risky, even fatal, to perform journalism in many parts of the world, especially in conflict or post-conflict zones. This is because during a conflict, the mass media has an additional social responsibility regarding what to report, what not to report, and how to report. This additional responsibility is very crucial because by nature of conflict, which is usually multidimensional in nature and manifestation, it demands proper understanding and analysis to avoid escalation. The attendant danger of inappropriate and inaccurate reportage during conflict cannot be overemphasized. As a result, the lack of social responsibility on the part of media may escalate conflict and cause more harm to the larger society. It's for this reason that media's function of reporting conflict involves much more than what is required of the media at the times of peace. For citizens in a conflict to make well-informed decisions and perhaps resolve their conflict, they must have good journalism. In reporting on conflict, journalists need to be able to analyze what's happening and to draw on their own analysis in posing the kinds of questions that will help people understand what's going on and why. The right to freedom of expression and information constitutes one of the essential foundations of democratic society. In conflict situations and wars, the role of media is crucial in providing public with accurate and timely information. Trustworthy news and images can contribute to the protection of civilians and conflict prevention, bring to attention of the international community the horrors of reality of conflict, and expose violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. For journalists, the suffering that comes with war has particular implications, both crucial and risky. Separating the word about what's happening is essential. Information has a direct impact on people's chances of survival in various circumstances. Reporters put their lives in danger to bring world the breaking news. They are first to witness and report on tragedies as they happen. They navigate through an endless stream of shocking and emotionally charged messages looking for the truth. As a consequence, the work of journalists in conflict zone is fraught with dangers, denial of access, censorship, harassment, arbitrary detention, and attacks are alarmingly frequent. As others who decide to work in conflict areas, journalists take consciously a special risk by working there. However, they are considered civilians and as such should not be targeted. Member states should recognize the crucial importance and role of journalism and media and individual journalists in times of conflict and aggression. Dear students, let's have a look at the protection of journalists that are promised under international law. One cannot emphasize the significance of journalistic coverage of conflicts. Journalists play a crucial role in the public interest by acquiring and sharing trustworthy information concerning conflicts. The public and decision makers are frequently made aware of grave human rights violations, war crimes, and other atrocities as a result of the work of journalists. They present the issue to us by going where others won't by speaking with individuals, checking the facts, and disseminating the news. Conflict coverage by journalists has occasionally assisted in the gathering of vital evidence by courts for the persecution of war criminals. As a result, their work can serve to provide evidence of crimes, uphold human rights, establish accountability, and promote global unity. This comes, however, with a price of their safety. For these reasons, journalists covering conflicts are afforded protection under international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols set out rules to protect people who are not taking part in fighting and those who can no longer fight. According to Additional Protocol 1, as long as they don't do anything that might jeopardize their status as civilians, journalists who are working on assignments for living in the areas of armed conflict must be treated as civilians and must be protected as such. Additionally, the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court declares that targeting civilians for attack, including journalists who are not participating in hostilities, is a war crime. Also, other UN bodies have adopted relevant resolutions. The Security Council passed 2 resolutions in 2006 and 2015, respectively, urging states to abide by their commitments under international law to stop impunity for major violations of humanitarian law and asking for an end to intentional attacks against journalists in armed conflict. In 2016, the UN published a plan of action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, and the UNESCO Director General reports regularly on the safety of journalists. In addition, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on the safety of journalists in 2020, in which it reaffirmed the principles of international humanitarian law applicable to journalists. Non-governmental human rights organizations, including organizations dedicated to the protection of journalists such as Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalists, and International Federation of Journalists, have been actively advocating for the protection of journalists and raising awareness on the issue of impunity of perpetrators of attacks against journalists. However, the actual situation differs significantly from these standards. Journalists are frequently subjects of targeted violence, abductions, and torture during armed conflicts. Those guilty for crimes against journalists should be investigated and persecuted effectively because when they are not, there is an atmosphere of impunity that only serves to encourage further violence. It's risky to report on armed conflicts, and the danger increases if participating states do not uphold the rules and regulations to which they are subject. This compromises the public's right to information by putting journalists' lives at danger, which also preventing them from providing accurate and timely information on matters of public interest. States may and should apply the existing rules to strengthen the safety of journalists who cover conflicts, even though it's impossible to guarantee zero risk. States involved in conflict situations uphold international humanitarian law and human rights law. Dear students, it will be interesting to look at the challenge faced by journalists across the world. Reporting conflict is never a straightforward task, and often a journalist will have only partial information because of physical difficulties and dangers involved. However, the basic journalistic instinct to question whatever they are told and look for evidence to support or devalue what is being said must remain the touchstone. Reporting about conflict and working in a conflict zone is complex. Often, the facts are not revealed in a way that offer the level of understanding the situation demands. The journalist needs to be sensitive, have an understanding of history, be aware of cultural issues, and put people before the story. Some of the issues are discussed here. The role of journalism at such times faces numerous challenges because of complexities involved. Journalists commit a larger chunk of their time to the coverage of war and other conflicts, endangering their lives in the process. Some of the challenges facing journalists revolves around their lives, while others to do with the technicality of conflict reporting. It is a very real possibility that journalists can go missing, be detained, or lose their lives while reporting on conflict. A lack of financial and technical support to journalists venturing into conflict zones, especially those from local language media, is an important area of concern, which has an impact on the quality and extent of coverage of conflict. The financial and professional pressure to report from danger zones in return for significant financial or professional rewards such as improved reputation or promotions is frequently absent, making the work of a dedicated conflict reporter difficult and thankless. As a result, conflict reporters are less motivated to pursue the in-depth story that lies beyond the headlines. Official pressure and lack of financial and political support prevent editors and newspaper management from pursuing articles that might be critical of the government position. In conflict zones, safety can be a daily struggle. Local reporters, regardless of work experience, especially can face hostile environments, even in their own hometowns due to lack of impunity. Having a local network such as fellow journalists, community members, translators, and security experts is a helpful way to improve safety. For journalists, these are hostile circumstances where they confront risks and danger, include death, injury, harassment, and jail. Additionally, they show instances that challenge the conventional wisdom on journalism, which is predicated on the objectivity of journalists. Journalists are expected to promote their own sides when the media is used as a tool for propaganda by opposing factions undermining their independence. Clearly, interviewing people in conflict zone also has additional problems and pitfalls. If they are civilians, they may be too traumatized to talk and may be actively hostile towards the media. Identity and non-recognition of it is a key factor in the rise of many conflicts and is equally significant how conflict gets covered. Often, journalists are identified by their national, ethnic, or religious affiliations by the communities they are reporting about. And this creates particular problems in terms of access to news and sources, as well as in how the reporter manages his or her own personal issues of identity in reporting. Identity often can also influence how a particular reporter's work is judged by reading public. Journalists feel pressure from their jobs and moral difficulties, as well as tension between their emotional participation and emotional detachment. Journalists who are also members of one of the disputing sides face additional ethical and professional challenge when they are covering a conflict. Whether deliberately or involuntarily, individuals become involved in conflict and are forced to deal with opposing values when there is a disagreement. On the one hand, their professional duty necessitates that they uphold their independence and impartiality in the face of numerous pressures from the government, military, and general public. On the other hand, like with foreign correspondents who cover other people's conflicts, they are members of their communities and their attachment makes it challenging for them to be objective towards the conflict. In other words, while they attempt to strike a balance between personal and professional pressures, journalists are caught in a crossfire. Social media gives a platform to voices that need to be heard, to be recognized, and links them to broader public for pluralized storytelling. Under targeted state crackdowns on internet and social media platforms, digital activism becomes vulnerable to political maneuvering and dictatorial control of information. In conflict-affected areas, blocking access to digital tools that are used to document and report abuses can contribute to further violence. Internet shutdown has also had a great impact on the work of journalists and researchers who are documenting human rights violations. They obstruct humanitarian aid and hinder journalism and documentation of rights violations. They also leave people who have loved ones in these conflict zones in fear, unable to reach family and friends or get them to safety. When reliable information is most needed, internet interruptions make it more difficult for media workers to complete their tasks. Journalists in conflict-affected societies are subject to covert, overt, and internal influences that compel them to practice self-censorship. These demands prevent them from accurately covering some events or reporting on them in a way that would not endanger themselves or others. Such pressures limit journalists' autonomy, making it difficult for them to put their professional role perceptions into practice. Needless to emphasize, the importance of safety of journalists is vital. While the advancement of information technology has markedly eased the job of the present generation of journalists, there still remains considerable tasks which require scribes to be physically on the ground. For interviewing victims and identifying perpetrators. Once in the field, journalists have to meet people with competing ideas and conflicting claims. Nowadays, most of the viewers, listeners, and readers have ability to figure out whether or not a particular reporter's coverage has been accurate, impartial, and responsible. In other words, journalists are expected to allow facts, the verified, to speak for themselves. All they can add are few words to explain the context and background to stories. Dear students, the role of editors is more crucial. Since they are essentially gatekeepers, they need to be extremely careful about the possible use and misuse of emotive or provocative words for the sake of ensuring accuracy and impartiality. It has been observed that journalists are doing almost everything to bring the news of war home and live. The motivation for this kind of assignments stems from the fact that war stories sell a great deal in today's modern world. The notion that bad news sells more than good news is quite true. In the process, journalists have endangered their lives, resulting in the death of significant number of reporters. For instance, the LTTE war resulted in the loss of tens of journalists over its long period. Some of these journalists were killed and hidden, such that no reports of deaths were captured in the news. Journalists should always wear protective equipment. They should be aware of the weapons being used around them and develop an escape plans for areas where they are reporting. First aid training and basic understanding of map reading can also be helpful. Besides physical harm, journalists also face the prospects of psychological challenge resulting from the effects of war. Threats to journalists are not exclusively physical. The mental health of journalists working in war zones is also at risk. Keeping on top of the stress of reporting and maintaining emotional stability can be just as important as physical safety. Reports have indicated that psychological stress is one of the leading challenges in war reporting. Dear students, the conditions that journalists persevere as they report war are psychologically disturbing. In this regard, most managers from different media stations desist from sending new journalists to war zones as they are more likely to suffer from effects of stress. The continuous sound of gunfire, mortar bombing is quite disturbing for people that have no military experience in their lives. Many of the journalists, therefore, end up inflicting psychological harm and eventually failing in their jobs. Moreover, the psychological challenge may come from long periods of captivity by warring parties that want to solicit and distort reporting information. The goal of these captions is to influence the reporting generated by media outlets and obtain a favorable position in the general sphere of media reporting. The result is an increase in the number of journalists maimed, resulting in overall poor performance. Notwithstanding the fact that not all of the dangers to which these journalists are subjects can be avoided, governments can and need to take greater steps to increase their safety. Dear students, while concluding this lecture, we can say that journalists provide accounts of events during war. However, these reporters are faced with numerous challenges in the course of their job which affect their personal and work lives. While some of these challenges can easily be overcome, Others, such as death, leave a permanent mark in their lives. The challenge is to find new ways of covering the ongoing problems and how to find a fresh approach which will inform and educate wider public. Reporters Without Borders has compiled and analyzed the figures for journalists killed during past 20 years. Two especially deadly decades for those in the service of right to information. What with murders, contract killings, ambushes, war zone deaths and fatal injuries, a staggering total of 1,668 journalists have been killed worldwide in connection with their work in last 2 decades. According to RSF's tallies, based above all its annual roundups. This gives an average of more than 80 journalists killed every year. The total killed since 2000 is 1,787. During the past decade, reporters have run the greatest risk in areas where armed clashes were taking place. Of the 686 killings since 2014, 335 have been in war zones, including Syria, Afghanistan and Yemen. Unfortunately, there are still many wars and violent events in our globe. Unfortunately, our world is still marked by high number of conflicts and by the consequences of natural disasters. The media must report on these, and their reporting should comply with high ethical and professional standards. The challenge is to find new ways of covering the ongoing problems and how to find a fresh approach which will inform and educate wider public. Everything in conflict reporting is about risk, and accepting and minimizing is paramount. By preparing for risk, analyzing potential threats, and being prepared to make safety decisions in the heat of moment, journalists can, if not completely ensure safety, at least be best prepared for the uncertainties of reporting in conflict zone. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding conflict reporting, issues and challenges. Hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.